Tonight, we are going to go ahead and do a presentation, and Dr. Mantia and I are basically going to tag team. And we have a different style to this presentation, and we worked on it today. And so we're excited to talk to you today about, we've talked a lot about the process that Dr. Mantia is leading us through in identifying the necessary reductions that we're going to have to be recommending. And so tonight we wanted to lead you through that process and to talk more about it and to just bring clarity to it, to make sure that everyone understands what the process is, where we're at in the process. And so as we talk through that process, the first step of the process is to identify the problem. And the problem is we are running out of money. It's just as clear as that. And you can see it in our 5-year forecast. When you look at our 5-year forecast, which anyone can access on our district website or on OD's website, in 2014, we run out of cash. We run out of cash. And next year, as we've talked a lot about, the $9 million that's been identified for reductions is the spending deficit. And so we're spending more than we're bringing in. The $9 million is to what extent we're spending more than we're bringing in, which is next year, which is $9 million. And so that's the first step, is identifying that problem. And so we've identified that problem. And so now Dr. Mantia is going to talk more about the rest of that process.
Good evening, everyone. There we go. First of all, the process that we use is really a decision-making process, so it can apply to a lot of venues. Not just a reduction process, it applies to any type of decision any organization might be encountering, which, as you well know, not only in the school business, but in any business, you have to make a lot of decisions to balance the budget. This decision-making process really allows us to create some dynamics for exchange and conversation. It is important to work through a lot of different angles as you look through your operations. The goal of decision-making process is to be proactive. It's focusing on what's critical, what's important, and it helps us to break down the issues and the decisions into logical parts that have high-quality ways of addressing it. And there's steps that create possibilities, probabilities, opportunities, and presents the bottom line problems. And in order to face the uncertainties that we face, and tonight our treasurer is telling us that there is more clear focus on a certainty, which is we're running out of money. And that certainty allows us to step back for a moment and go through a decision-making process that allows us to look at a broader scope of the operation. So we have identified the problem. There are a number of issues we could face, but right now we have narrowed. It's like writing a dissertation. If anybody's ever written a dissertation, it is a problem statement. A lot of people want to go, but the problem is we are running out of money. And with that, we have to move into identifying how we go about addressing the 5-year forecast. And next year, we are looking at the first year without any additional revenue. We are looking at the first year, which would be 2012 and 13, to reduce $9 million. Thereafter, without any additional revenue, there would be further reductions, but we're only going to deal right now with next year's reductions. What we want to do then is, once we identify the problem, and it is currently the stage that we're in, is to analyze. And we want to go through a number of processes in order to analyze the situation we're in. This is a very large organization. It has a lot of components to it. And so gathering data is a process that is important because without correct data, you're guessing. And if the board would remember, on November 28th, I gave a preview of some of the formats that we were using. I don't know if you remember some of those formats, but the formats, we have some samples up here. I know you can't see this well, but this is called it's a decision matrix that has buildings that are listed, and it has, based on criteria, what high need areas are. So it helps us to focus where high need areas are. That's one example of a format that we use to collect data. We also use another sampling to collect data, which is coming up here. I think it's probably I used an example of a high school audit. There are other examples, such as using some of the baseline data. For example, what are graduation requirements? That's the kind of data that's going to drive a lot of the decisions as we go through the analysis. So where we're at right now, we have collected data, and we will continue to collect data. And if you could back up to all of those circles for a moment, I don't know if you can go back one more time. But these circles we're always moving around in this data collection circle. So we collect the data, we analyze the data, we develop options, and we evaluate options. And where we're at currently is gathering data, continue to gather data, and right now we're analyzing the data. We will analyze it for a lot of different things. Cost. We'll analyze the data based on student ratios, the cost of delivering the service, the high need areas, what the trends of enrollment. So all of the data takes us to a place where we're looking at cost, and we're looking at cost in the areas of academic and extracurricular programming. We're looking at the data based on human resources, that is everybody who's employed and what they do, how much they do of it. And then the operational side, maintenance, facilities, the things that we have to do to keep 24 buildings up and running. Those are all contributing to the cost, and that's the kind of data that will need analysis. But the analysis is one part, but the second part is what we do with money. And that money is ultimately to gain the greater benefit of serving students and their needs. In between all of that, there are restrictions, guidelines, and requirements that are required by the federal, state, and we have our own district guidelines. And those requirements meet either what students need, and they also will be driving parts of the cost. So all of those factors are part of the analysis. I'm going to go back to the other circles. We will be developing options. Those options, we are not at that point yet, but we will be looking at options once we know our cost. Where do we need to go? And then the last component in this circle is to evaluate. We'll be looking at whether to consolidate, streamline, modernize, eliminate, or keep. These are the important parts when you look at the options and you're trying to reduce cost. You have several alternatives to make sure you're the most efficient and effective in your delivery of service. And then those options you have to evaluate to determine how student needs are affected and what the impact eventually is on students. In the long run, we want to be leaner but stronger. The next part is to decide and implement. This is a really important process because as we move through these circles, we will have to take a look at the options, and if you'll zoom into the options, that's a part when we're at the options, we have to solicit public input. Now that's not a one-time event, folks. I wanted to bring it tonight. I have an envelope like this thick of public input, hundreds and hundreds of comments and suggestions and ideas. So what we have to create and will be creating is venues for public input, not only to look at the options, but to take a look at where we've been. Where have we been, and where do we need to go? Also, as much as the public has input, much of our decisions and the options that we need to get to will be driven by our revenue status. If we have less money, it changes the type of options that we have to consider. So the revenue status, whether it's a levy that passes or a levy that fails, it changes the revenue flow, which ultimately will change the cost and ultimately will change the way we decide on our options. Then, of course, the rest of the circle, we would execute the decision, we would evaluate and revise based on what we've learned, and that process should never change in good decision making. If we're not always reevaluating where we're at, then I think it becomes stagnant and mundane. So we're always having to reevaluate where we're at. So the bottom line is, here we are. We're at identifying the problem. We're right now in the analysis phase. We'll be working on all the components of that and eventually deciding and implementing so that we can meet the identified problem, and that is currently we're running out of money. We need to communicate. We need to listen. These processes are important for our public to understand, and it is a process that I think people will appreciate and ultimately the district will benefit from. So it's a brief overview. I wanted to make sure that the board had one more time. I'll be talking about this every time I come back to the board. I'll be talking about the next steps. Obviously, in the analysis stage, there is a lot of data to collect from all of the departments I just talked about. But in due time, I'll keep coming back to the board so that you are privy to discussion and dialogue about the data collection and the options that we have to consider, knowing we're running out of money and we have a $9 million reduction that we have to face very shortly.